Good evening, everybody, and welcome to True Crime with the Sarge. I'm your host, Joseph Jacqueline. We have a very exciting guest tonight. It's all going to be about emergency communication, about crisis communication, about all the things that we talk about here on True Crime with the Sarge, as well as on the media, about how certain agencies do good jobs, how they do bad jobs. But we're going to hear from the expert himself tonight. Please welcome, I'm going to bring him onto the stage right now, Doug Levy. Now, Doug is going to give him a quick bio. He is the author of the Communications Golden Hour, the essential guide to public information. When every minute counts, it's now in its second edition. He's been a firefighter, a journalist. He helps out police departments and fire departments in the health industry all over the country with their communication to try to get them to do a better job at getting that information out there about transparency, about public information. So, welcome to the show, Doug. Thanks for coming on. I know you're a busy man.
I'm delighted to be here. Your audience is very important for this topic.
Yes, thank you. So we're dealing with a couple of emergencies almost right off the bat today. What we're going to get into at different times, but we have the Baltimore bridge accident. We have, and even this Diddy Combs, right? This guy is, flying all over the country as the FBI is raiding his houses and all over the country, and that becomes a police nightmare thing, so to speak. But let's get into some of the basics when we're dealing with communication. Because we know now everybody wants the police department to be transparent, right? To get it out there as fast as they can. What's the caveat of putting information out there too fast?
The biggest mistake that happens is when you put information out that turns out to be wrong. What you have to do is make sure you understand, why do people want to know what's happening? What do they need to know? What do they need to do? And why is it important? How does this affect them? If you're the PIO for a Metropolitan Police Department and you have a major incident that is blocking a highway, and you get a phone call from the traffic reporter at your local news station, all that person's going to care about is what roads are blocked and what are the alternate routes, and how long before traffic's going to get back to normal. That's probably not what your commander at the scene is thinking, even though that's important. And there are other reporters that'll be calling that will want different information, but you have to know who's affected. How can you make them less affected? If it's a safety situation, how do you keep them out of danger? And you have to really focus on that very specific purpose for that audience in particular. It's very rare that one message is going to cover everything. You focus on what's most important first, and then go from there. If it's a life safety situation, skip all the other stuff. Get right to the point. Stay away from whatever the location is. Go here or stay home. Whatever your message of safety is, deal with all the other stuff later.
Exactly. But we see sometimes police departments, sometimes they say, guys, you're not firemen. You're putting all these fires out instead of just concentrating on organizing your information. Tell us a couple of those steps. I know it's covered in your book in the first couple of chapters about organizing the information as it's coming in, because as the public information officer or the chief is going to do this. We're going to talk about that later on. They're getting stuff from all over the place. How do they organize all that information? What's the best practice that you can advise?
Probably the most important thing is for chiefs and all command level police executives need to not only understand, but actually treat communications as part of their tactical response to any incident. It is every bit as important as every other squad that you're calling out. Because if you've got the public involved, either physically or just because they're going to see what's happening, there's got to be communications. Communications done right keeps people safe. It helps catch the bad guys. And it helps bring resources to your department when you need them. Done wrong, you potentially put people at risk. You lose trust, and you wind up with other problems that are entirely avoidable. And that's the sort of thing that happens if the PIO is the afterthought, or finds out too late. One of the best practices, and we've seen more and more departments do this, you have a prepared standing message that's ready to go out within minutes of a major emergency or a report of a major emergency. And it's deliberately vague. It says, we are responding to reports of, and then you give a very broad description of what the incident may be. You probably want to tell people stay away from that area, and we'll provide updates when we can, or soon, or in some cases you can give a time. You put something out fast so that people know you're on it and that you're going to share more when you can. Among other things, that reduces the likelihood that somebody who may have wrong information intentionally or unintentionally, it's usually unintentionally, puts their information out. And if they're the only one communicating, the media is going to run with that, or the neighbors. The possibility of amplifying wrong information has skyrocketed thanks to social media. So you want to make sure that your voice is heard first.
Right. And part of that is who gives out the message. I've been a firm believer that the initial stages of anything, whether it's an investigation or a major incident like we saw with the boat this morning, the public information officer give out that information, because the situation's fluid. Things are going to change. When the boss himself or herself gives the initial statement and it's wrong, it's hard to walk that back when you're the person in charge. And where first of all, where should that person be anyway?
That's exactly right. You need to have somebody who has enough authority to be credible, but that's not automatically the top person, and rarely is it the top person, quite frankly. If it's a really small department, maybe, but a good PIO speaks with the authority and credibility of the chief. The community knows that person, recognizes the face, trusts them. That's the most important thing. If you're communicating on a regular basis, then you are able to step in an emergency and immediately have the credibility that is essential. And you're absolutely right. You need to make sure that there's some protection in case something has to be walked back. But the other thing to do, it's important to prevent yourself from saying something that you have to walk back. We've seen many examples where this was not done, and in a few situations, we're still paying the consequences of it. If you don't know all the facts, you really need to say that. If you have a preliminary set of facts, make sure you say, at the moment, what we know is we were alerted at 3:51 a.m. that whatever happened. We were on the scene at 3:54. On arrival, the first units observed what? We know that we have this many victims. They're in critical condition. We're still gathering information. We'll tell you more when we can. Everything that I said there was provably true. It's like, I didn't get into anything about what caused the incident, who was responsible. I focused on the time we got a call, the time we showed up, what was observed on arrival, how many victims do we know for sure. Safe stuff.
It's simple, but we see things happen over and over again that you just kind of shake your head. I mean, we were speaking offline. We mentioned Uvalde, right, about all the problems that we saw with that communication part of it. I mean, the list can go on, but it's something that it doesn't seem that we're learning from some of these mistakes, and that's what I fear. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on here tonight, to get an expert to actually talk to people out there, who watched our show, who are police executives, who are people in the true crime community, who follow these stories very closely, and then to make them understand that this is like super important.
I get really queasy when I find out that there's been some kind of a response drill that did not have a communications element to it. It's kind of unthinkable that anybody would do that now, but I know that happens. And as I said earlier, there's some departments that think of communications as more of an afterthought. And in fact, communications done well really helps your department. It's so important to have good relationships with the community between incidents so that when things happen, good or bad, you've got that credibility. And if you don't have those relationships, it will really be hard to build them if and when something bad happens. If people have no idea who you are, why should they trust you?
And how do you recover from that, right? I mean, that's where the PR now comes in regards to this. Like, how do you recover? So all of this stuff is really intertwined between getting the crisis information out there, dealing with the PR issues, because silence is never a good response, right? Because
silence speaks definitely not.
Silence speaks volumes, right? I mean, it's just something that you deal with.
Well, and something that is frequently misunderstood. And the first time that I was working with law enforcement, I had to really do a lot of education with them. I had to learn more about policing, but they had to learn more about communications to understand why saying nothing was never the right answer. That doesn't mean you're sharing all of your investigative details. In fact, it's the opposite. The best way to keep things from getting out is by putting out what you can. There's also ways to tell people we can't share these details because we're still doing our investigation, or we're going to, let the prosecutors decide what gets shared in court. Whatever the right answer is. If there's a legitimate reason to not share information, that's fine. But the other thing too, there's also a belief, and we've seen this with a lot of departments who, as good as most police officers are, in every industry, you do get some bad apples. And some departments, when they've had someone do something wrong or accused of doing something wrong, they think that clamming up is the right answer. And there's an old saying that, dead fish don't smell better with time.
I never heard that one, but that's good.
I think I probably botched the expression a little bit, but, whether the news is good or bad, the quicker you get it out, the quicker you're able to deal with it and eventually recover. And one of the best practices, and there's a chief in one of the Texas cities is a big advocate of this. They have an SOP that within, I believe their SOP is that within 24 hours of a critical incident, everything that they have that is releasable will be released. So body cam footage, initial reports, whatever, so that in one organized briefing, they put it all out there. And that's a PI, the person that developed that protocol had to deal with some pretty ugly stuff. Ugly meaning, misconduct by officers, as well as good work. But if you just do that as your standard practice, you are on much stronger ground whenever something happens, good or bad.
And we know that doesn't happen specifically with body cams, right? We see some police departments when it seems to be that it's in their favor, they release it right away. And when it's not, they tend to hold on to it a little longer. And you really can't do that. I'm assuming you feel that way in regards to the communication that comes out of that?
Absolutely. In fact, there was a case which I don't have all the specifics on in front of me, but it was, I believe, in a West Coast city where that's exactly what happened. They sat on the body cam footage longer than they had to. So, I mean, every state's got laws on what can be released and when and so on. And some states, unfortunately, also make it much harder than it should be. That's a whole other discussion that we can avoid. But in this case, I know the department held onto the footage longer than legally required. And whether they had a legitimate reason to do that or not, it did not help them maintain whatever trust they had with the public.
Yeah, it takes years to build that trust, and it takes minutes to lose it. And sometimes police chiefs and they forget that, or they get away from it, and it's just something that is just bad policy. And like I said, I've been outspoken. I've done a lot of media myself on this, and just say, when the cops do a good job, I say it. When the cops do a bad job, I also say it. I don't play the game. Well, I used to be a cop, so I don't do if they did bad. No, this is about improvement. It's about training. What are some of the skills that this PIO has to have, or should they have a background in journalism or reporting, or what are some of the recommendations that you make to police departments and other agencies?
So I probably am a little bit biased because I have not been a sworn police officer. My emergency services work was I helped run a very busy volunteer fire department in suburban Baltimore years ago, and was an active firefighter for a while. But and I've consulted with and advised a number of law enforcement agencies. I believe the best public information model is the hybrid model, which you'll see in the NYPD, the LAPD, and many of the big departments, where you have sworn officers and professional communicators working together so that you have the best of both. If I'm trying to work with the police department to put information out, I must have a sworn officer's expertise, in particular, to help make recommendations on what information should be withheld, what information isn't available for whatever reason. Stuff that's important that I'm not necessarily going to know as a civilian. However, as a civilian, I am able to bring that outside perspective that is critical. Effective communications requires really understanding who you are communicating with. What do they know? Who do they trust? Who do they get their information from, or how do they get their information? If you don't consider those elements as you craft your messaging, it's not going to work. And I mean, I've worked with some people in law enforcement who really don't understand that piece. And unfortunately, I have seen public information releases about really good police work fall completely flat, or even generate negative reactions because it was written from the cop's perspective without recognizing what the audience thinks or believes. You have to factor in both.
Right, and I've seen the pushback on this now. So people come out and saying, "Stop taking the exact words that the police are using in regards to these situations." I mean, listen, some of it is just the anti-cop mentality. I get it. A lot of that is pretty pervasive, but I can understand from the media point of view when they get information that is wrong initially, and without that kind of statement saying, "Listen, this situation's fluid. Things are going to change. Just be aware that this is not gospel, so to speak. I mean, it's going to change as soon as we get more information. So just be patient."
Well, and unfortunately, law enforcement as a profession has gotten some black eyes, some unfairly, for sure, and unfortunately, some with good reason. And I believe it was the Washington Post did a really good series of articles, I think about 2 years ago, where they looked at police public information after some of the really bad incidents. And even some of the well-regarded departments put out news releases that turned out to be pretty far from what really happened. And as you said, if you do that, you do not recover quickly from that. It's not okay. A good police officer is an arbiter of truth.
Yeah. And like I said, I always say the 800-pound gorilla in the room is the Uvalde incident, where that information about where they engaged the suspect and the shooter and all that stuff that turned out to be absolutely false, not even close.
Well, and I mean, I sadly I remember that day all too well. I actually have a good friend who's from there, and um, I was following the early information, and I saw what the official messages were while that was happening, and just from what was obvious from what was on TV, I could tell that the information that was being put out officially could not possibly have been accurate. You know, they were clearly unprepared for that, for any kind of a major incident. And whoever was actually doing the communications was not properly prepared to understand the significance of putting out a wrong message. Because they actually put out a message early on during that incident saying everybody was safe. We knew that was impossible.
Right, exactly. I mean, even the fact about them confronting the shooter and all this other stuff that was going on, that and then all of a sudden we see the body cam footage about what really happened. It was bad. I mean, and people have lost their jobs over it, and rightly so. And it's not the first
Right.
police department that's happened to.
No, it just, we had 19 kids and 2 teachers perish, and everybody seemed to be covering their own whats. And the mess there inflicted tremendous, I mean, on top of the horror of the incident itself, the absence of good communications actually elevated the pain to the families and the whole community. The police changed their story of what happened in substantial ways 3 times in the first 72 hours. And that was, as we know, just the beginning. What turned out to actually happen was entirely different, and that's really a shame.
We have a good question here from the audience. Elevate the process. You were close on that one there. Says, question, what are examples of questions that media should ask at a news conference? Do you have any suggestions?
So one thing that's important to bear in mind is that the media is very different in 2024 compared to the way it was when I was cutting my teeth as a reporter. You have fewer journalists who are professionally trained career journalists, although you have some, and some are very, very good and committed to finding facts and reporting things truthfully. However, because of digital media and other factors, pretty much anybody with a smartphone is a journalist. And that's okay, but it makes it harder to get messages out that are accurate. And because of the way the media makes money now, there is less of an incentive to do really good quality reporting, and there's more of an incentive to get clicks and views and so on. You need to know that when you're preparing for a news conference so that you can kind of anticipate where could things go off the rails and prepare. But for reporters, the kinds of things that should be part of every story involving a police department is, what happened? Who did it? How do you know that? What happens next? Is anybody arrested? If there were weapons discharged, who fired first? How many shots were fired? Who responded? The basic details. If it's farther along in an investigation and something, we know that somebody was shot by a police officer, for example, who's investigating? Why is it being handled by that other agency? When are we going to get the body cam footage? Can we interview the officer? The answer probably is no, but those are the kinds of things that should be asked. What's the disciplinary record here? And again, that's going to vary from state to state in terms of what's available. But those are the kinds of questions that should be asked, probably will be asked. And if you're the police department, you need to be thinking about, what do you need the public to know? What can you say that will reassure your community that you are doing your jobs? Communicate whether they are at any kind of risk. If so, what are you doing to mitigate that risk, and what can they do to stay safe? If you look at the communications on July 4th, I guess 2 years ago, with the Highland Park shooting at the parade, Chris Cavelli from the Lake County Sheriff's Department really managed those briefings as well as I've ever seen anybody do briefings during a very dangerous situation. He understood that they had a gunman at large who had already killed a number of people, and people were scared, and rightly so. He made sure that they were briefing frequently and clearly about, what do we know? What do we need people to do to stay out of harm's way? And how are we handling this investigation? He was focused on telling people, you need to stay home and lock your doors until we catch this guy. Really important message.
Yes.
It's not the time to bring, politicians out to clear their throats in front of the TV cameras. You need to get the most important information out quickly, succinctly, and then go back to work.
Exactly. And it's like one of the things I always tell the audience here, or when I do my own training or I go to schools, I try to explain the press conferences can hold a lot of information, and you have to be listening to sometimes what's not being said. And one of the things I always tell reporters, because I talk to many of them, ask the magic question is there a danger to the public? Because that leads you to what the police really think who the suspect is or isn't at that point. It's like the number one question, and I rarely hear it asked.
You're exactly right.
Because, like I said, if the police say there's no threat to the public, okay, they know who the suspect is. It's probably, acquaintance, or they know each other, or domestic, or something like that. So there's nothing to worry about, that kind of thing. But if they say, well, we don't know yet, then it's something to. Then they have to explain. Okay, guys, lock your doors and batten down the hatch, so to speak. But they should be doing that anyway if it's not.
Yeah. The other thing that we need to be really mindful of is jargon, and one that has tripped up a number of departments over the years is referring to somebody who has been shot by officers as in custody. I totally understand that technically that's true, but it's not going to make it's the public is not going to get it. And just that kind of sensitivity. I mean, you can say, the suspect turned and discharged his weapon in the direction of the three officers who were pursuing him. They returned fire. The suspect fell down and was arrested. That's different from taken into custody. It's just it's a degree kind of thing. But you don't want to hide the fact that person was taken down by gunfire.
No, it's a good point. I mean, we just saw in New York City, just had a police officer shot and killed on this whole thing. And to me, it kind of was slow getting out there, getting the information out there and looking at some of the things. I started in the police department in 1992, and I saw the days of Ray Kelly, we used to refer to it as the Iron Curtain. Nothing came out. And if anything came out, it came from Ray Kelly. That was it. Now we're seeing something totally different. Is there a happy medium, or do you think one is better than the other?
I think generally you want the happy medium. NYPD is kind of in its own league because of how big it is. I mean, 35,000 sworn officers, 20,000 civilian staff. I mean, 55,000 people is more than a lot of cities. But they have also really proven the value of decentralized communications. When I was living in New York, that was when they rolled out social media for all 77 precincts. And the next step of that was media training for all command level staff. Not necessarily because a precinct commander was going to be doing a news conference necessarily, but the kinds of skills that you need to do a media interaction well also serve you well when you're standing in front of a community group or just talking to one person. Have a clear key message, know how to say it, understand who you're talking to, recognize what they're interested in, and how do you build that connection with people? Everybody who's going to be a leader needs those skills. It's really important. The other thing is that by having that kind of decentralized communications, when something bad happens, you are in a position of having somebody who is probably known to the community in a place to communicate. And one example of that, and I think this was a shooting that was in Brooklyn, and I think it was in 2016, but I'm not completely sure, but I'm pretty sure I have this one in my book. There was a bad shooting. It was a call for a mentally disturbed individual, and the first officer who responded was not from the area, or was unfamiliar with the individual who had a history of police calls, and shot and killed an older woman in her home. It was kind of as bad as you might be able to get. I mean, it was an awful, awful incident. And the local commanders briefed the media. They had people from downtown there, but it wasn't, it was somebody local to the area doing the talking. And as bad as that was, it went a really long way to addressing the community's concerns, because this was somebody that they had some respect for. And it also made it possible for the next day for the chief of the department to come out and say something slightly different. It was that layer of cover. It wasn't that something was being walked back, but the emphasis, the briefing, 90 minutes after the incident was mostly the facts and expressing condolences to the family. Though, that's kind of all you can do in the immediate time. The next day, they were able to add some qualitative comments about how the response was handled and what should have happened or could have happened that was different. You can't do that right away. So you need that cover.
You brought up a good point. I didn't even realize it as now that I think about it, it's like you put the red light in my head about teaching the COs how to do this, because they do all these community meetings, they do all this stuff, so they need to have this training too, because they are representing the department, they are giving out public information, so they need to know what they can and what they can't do. I never thought of it that way, but that's actually pretty interesting.
It's also really important if you want to get good stories out there, because I mean, face it, the headquarters folks are going to hear about bad things really fast. In a lot of places, they're not going to hear about the good stuff, because cops do good things all the time. That's the job. But the precinct commanders, the local captains, and so on, if they're in a position to say, hey, our overnight folks caught a burglar, and it's because they are really good at what they do, that's a good message.
Yeah, it's good. And you know what, though? Sometimes we get caught. I got caught up in the fact that when you're talking to the media is one thing, but when you're talking to the public, even though there's no media present, it's the same exact thing.
Well, and that is the reason that I'm not the only one who is suggesting that some degree of media awareness ought to be integrated into all police training. Well, actually, I personally think it should be all training for every profession, because literally the most junior person in any organization has the potential to be the next viral video, and you don't want to be the bad one.
And if you train your lowest ranking members of the service, the police officer, eventually he or she is going to get promoted. They're going to be coming up the ranks, and they've already been, exposed to this. The patrol guy basically had told the cops, your role in this is you don't say anything. You say, talk to DCPI. That's the message.
Yeah, and that's not really a good message, especially in these days where every one of us has, a smartphone, and anything you say in public could be on YouTube. And in fact, look at all the examples where you have really good examples. I think there was a video a couple of weeks ago. Starbucks has gotten beaten up many, many times for all kinds of things, some legit, some bogus, whatever. But somebody went into a Starbucks and started being really nasty to one of their counter people, and somebody else was videotaping. Don't know why, but the person behind the counter handled this negative person so gracefully and professionally and calmly. It became a viral video of how to do it right, how to treat people with respect.
And that's good PR.
Yeah, exactly. And that's better than anything that might be produced at some central place.
So we had a question from Karen Lee here, says, how important is the personality and demeanor of the public information officer, the PIO?
Great question. A good PIO knows the subject, knows how to communicate about the subject, is able to connect with the audiences, and can be trusted. It's hard to do that if you have no personality. If you are really like a Joe Friday, just the facts kind of person, you'll be okay, but you're not going to bring new people in. You're not going to keep people interested. But if you have somebody like Chief Phil Smith, who's now, Phil Smith has recently been named the chief of police in Evansville, Indiana. He was a PIO. And one of the reasons he was a really good PIO is that he was really relatable. He was able to connect with kids and adults, people from all sides of town, sometimes because he was extra creative, sometimes just because he's got this great personality. People are naturally drawn to hear what he wants to say or what he is saying. And those PIOs are absolutely the kind that you want, as long as they are legit. Phil is great because he's a cop. He's been a cop for, a very long time. He's very good at what he does, which is how he can explain it so well. That credibility is so important, and you can't make that up. You can't invent that. You can't just bring in, and one of the mistakes I see all the time is when bad things happen, sometimes a department will hire a PR firm. And there are plenty of good PR counselors who work with police departments. There also are some that are not as good. And you can't put lipstick on a pig and expect it to do any good. If something bad happens, you might need a professional to coach the people who know what they're talking about and who can connect with the local audience because they've already got those relationships. We can help you do it better, but you still have to have that innate ability to communicate that is essential to a PIO. So yes, you need to have the knowledge, you need to have the skill to convey the words well. You do probably want somebody who makes a good appearance. And the fact is there are some folks that are probably not the best suited to be on camera. And I'm usually one of those. I like helping other people do the talking, but that's a very specific to each community kind of thing. If you've got somebody who, stutters, but is loved by the community because he or she has lived there for 30 years and everybody knows that person, that's probably fine. And Nothing wrong with it.
Not a good time for nepotism and cronyism, specifically for a position like that.
Right.
Just pick
And
the right people.
I know a lot of departments rotate people through the PIO shop as just a routine thing. And while I do think everybody rising up and through the command levels should have experience as a PIO, the PIO role really is a professional role. And because it is so dependent on those relationships that you establish with the community, with the media, it's probably not a position that should be rotated around. It really should be a career path for people who really want to do it. It frustrates me when I meet people who wind up as PIOs because they got assigned to it. They didn't want it. They don't really want it. They don't like dealing with the public and so on. Well, that's not a good role.
Yeah, it doesn't work in the police department. I've experienced that myself. You force somebody to do something, they're going to give you half of what they can actually do, and that's not a good thing.
Right.
There are links going out now for Doug's book. He is offering a special discount if you're interested in picking up the second edition of his textbook, or his guide, excuse me. And then there are some other information out there, including his website, if you want to learn more about Doug. And he runs some workshops we're going to get into at the end of the show tonight. When you're dealing with a crisis, like, so for instance, we had in your book, we know that there's James O'Neill, who I worked for when I was a part of FED, the Fugitive Enforcement Division, in cold case, and he dealt with the terrorist incident that happened on the West Side Highway. Can we talk about that a little bit? We don't want to give away all the secrets of the book, but we want to make sure that people can get a taste of it, so they go out and get it.
So the West Side Highway incident and the Birmingham bombing, which Birmingham, the United Kingdom, those two events are really good examples of how to get communications out to the public very quickly, even before you don't have all the information. In the NYPD situation, the first message that went out on the official NYPD channels was within the first 20 minutes. And it was really simple. It's, we are responding to reports of an incident on the West Side Highway, stay away from the area. And it was just very short and sweet, but it was putting the flag in the ground so that before you had a lot of witnesses posting their own stories of what happened, you had the official authority. And then very quickly after that, I believe it was within less than 20 minutes later, they had information from an officer on the scene. So they were able to put out some additional information, which included that the threat had been removed. This was no longer an active incident. That's critically important. They followed it with a briefing in person. In that case, it included the chief, with very clear messaging that explained how and why the police were confident that there weren't other people planning similar attacks. And a big part of the message was, here's what we're doing so that New Yorkers can go out and celebrate. I believe it was on Halloween. We're deploying additional officers throughout the city to make sure that you're safe as you carry on your normal business. And in large part because the NYPD had already established the pattern of that kind of rapid communication. And because the people who were doing the speaking were at the very least known to the media, there wasn't a lot of question about whether they actually knew what they were talking about. They had the credibility. Maybe they didn't have as much trust as you would like, but they had facts, they shared the facts, and they did their best to demonstrate why what they were saying was believable.
Exactly. It's a great point. That's why I wanted to make sure that we got it out there. Listen, like I said, when the cops do a good job, we need to also do that. But there's been plenty of bad things that have happened also. So right now we're just there's this terrible accident that's happened on the bridge in Baltimore, and I know you've been traveling, so you really haven't been on top of everything that you normally would be. But some of the things that I've seen already from, let's say, the governor or some of the other local officials is, like we're watching this, we're doing this. It seems to be like more photo ops than anything else about actually getting the information out there, which has led to lots of speculation now. And this thing is growing its legs. And how do police departments or even government officials now at this point, it's not really a criminal investigation yet, right? But people are calling for one. How do you handle this three-headed monster now?
So anything at this scale is obviously going to be enormously complicated for every reason that you can imagine. A big part of it is who's in charge. And that authority is going to change as the incident grows. Ideally, all those different responding agencies have worked together, at least on tabletop drills, and have a plan in place for how to do the joint communications. Because there's nothing worse than having the transportation department say one thing and the police department to say something else. We have seen that happen in other incidents, so it's a very real risk. There's probably not a lot we can do to keep the politicians out of the way, although I wish they would just stay in their little box, but that's not realistic. When the incident first is happening, you have to first think about life safety. So, they closed the bridge, which is impressive. I don't know what the timeline is from when they got the first alert from, I guess, the Coast Guard to shutting down the traffic, but that unquestionably saved lives. But they have to very quickly explain why they've closed the bridge and how long is the bridge going to close. Now, of course, then the bridge collapsed. So now you've got to tell people, okay, stay away. The highway is going to be closed till further notice. And then as quickly as possible after that, what can they do in the meantime? So is there an alternate route, or do we need to all work from home or whatever? Once we know that this is a huge disaster, you've got all the other agencies involved. So you're going to have a joint information command. Ideally, you've got all the different agency PIOs working together, designating a single PIO to be kind of in charge. You're coordinating it so that you've got coordinated messages, consistent messages put out at a regular time. You don't need to wait for a briefing. If you've got important information, put it out on social media, give it to people any way that you can. Don't make them wait around. Don't make them wonder. Don't leave room for people to speculate. And then, again, as the incident scales, you need to clarify who's doing what. And as things get complicated, you probably are going to have specific interviews or briefings by the NTSB, separate ones from the transportation department, separate ones from EMS. You're going to have the fire department explain, how many units did they send to the scene, how many divers went into the water, what did they do, what did they find, and so on. So you have each of those sectors. But again, all the information is being coordinated so that nobody is saying one thing on channel 12 and something else on channel 6, or saying something that is inconsistent with what people can see with their own eyes, because that's the other thing that is really important. So it's that coordination that's really important. Luckily, in this case, it's all within Maryland, so you don't have states competing with each other. Unfortunately, we have seen many incidents that cross state boundaries, and you wind up with different authorities saying entirely different things, and that does not help. And again, everybody who's communicating really needs to think hard about what is their role, what is their job, who are they responsible to, and what are those people's interest in this? Is it just because they've seen this horrible thing on TV and they're interested, or because their life is going to be affected by this? Focus on the most important part first.
Yeah, because I haven't even heard about, well, people have to go to work tomorrow. How do they go about doing it? Right. So exactly what you're saying, because this is the first thing the public is thinking, like, I got to go to work. And as soon as this thing happened and they shut down the bridge, I saw a news outlet said people upset that bridge is closed. The bridge isn't there anymore. I mean, what are we talking about here? What are you not happy
Oh,
about?
and that, I mean, it bothers me when I see media outlets write things like that. And I mean, it's really sad to see how the media has changed, and now we've got. I mean, on one of my devices, it defaults to a portal page that I don't even know who puts it out, but it's AI written headlines, and the news is pulled from all kinds of different social media and other outlets, and it's almost always materially wrong. There's no editor making judgments, and that makes it really hard when you have important information to communicate. But it also makes it even more important to have a very clear message and to focus on what is most important. I've done a lot of workshops with scientists. I've done a lot of work with scientists over the years. And one of the things that we work on very intensely is watching and understanding how a good public information officer takes very detailed scientific information and boils it down to what is the most important. And if your entire orientation is towards precision, it is very hard to understand why your precise number is rounded when communicated to the public. But if you're trying to tell people it's dangerously hot outside, you need to get indoors, does it matter whether it's 103 degrees or 101? It's too hot to be outside, get indoors, is a much more effective public message.
Do the terms public relations, public information, and transparency, are they all the same, or they're intertwined, or should be held differently, kind of thing? Should they be treated differently?
I
Sorry if I
think
put you
there's
in a spot
no
there.
the big sigh was that the answer is kind of yes. Um, I think there's a little bit of a nuance difference. In my mind, public relations has acquired a negative connotation, yet is really an honorable profession of helping people communicate to a broader audience. The best public relations people, many of them started out as journalists, and many of them think of themselves as journalists, except that they're reporting on things inside an organization and working with the leadership to decide what gets published externally. Public information officer is a role, and public information is a role that is typically within a government organization where we have statutes that dictate what is public. And I think the biggest thing that distinguishes a general PR person from a PIO is a PIO has to be not just an advocate for the organization, but an advocate for the public. Um, when I've been a PIO, I have in many situations had to explain to leadership people, no, we do not have a choice about releasing this information because the law says it's public. So let's find this information, let's figure out what it is, and release it because we have to. You're not going to find that in a corporate PR department as much.
No.
As far as transparency goes, transparency, I think, is just good government. People have a right to know how their tax dollars are being spent. What are the people that are employed by us collectively doing? And if something bad happens, how did it happen? What are we doing to prevent it from happening again? And I can't think of any situations where educating people more about how we work has been a bad thing. It's almost always, I would actually argue it's always good for the public to understand more about us.
That's a great answer, right? So, I mean, that's just something because these words get thrown around an awful lot, specifically in the media about policing and about other types of emergency things. It seems as if though the police are held to a different standard in regards to some of these incidents than they do with some of the other agencies. I see some of the other agencies don't really handle a lot of these things. The police department is front and center on everything.
I think that's true, and I think to some extent, it's just the nature of the job. I mean, what other government units have that much public interaction?
Right. And
The
they
other
need the
thing,
training.
yes, absolutely. The other thing that's important to keep in mind too is, I mean, obviously you and I are different, but for the average citizen, how many people are, you know, automatically associate something good with an encounter with a police officer? Unfortunately, a lot of people, you talk about police, the first thing they think about is a speeding ticket. And that's not a good thing. You know, we need more relationships so that people understand that, first of all, cops are people too. Most of them are working really hard. Many of them live in your community and have the same kinds of things to care about as you do. And the more that people understand that, the better. You know, that distance between is a real problem. I've met a lot of people who have had really bad experiences with police, and I obviously don't know the whole story. I don't know the other side, but if you have people in a community who remember when they went to the police station to report a crime or to get help, and they were treated poorly, or they felt they were treated poorly, why would you expect them to trust you when you need their help?
Exactly. Exactly, and that starts at the lowest level of the police department. Train people to treat people right, and then you don't have some of these issues that you deal with in regards to this. So there's just about 2 minutes left, Doug. I got to ask you one question: social media, good, bad, or ugly?
All three.
Okay.
But this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where everybody at every level of any organization, but especially police departments, needs to have an awareness of how their actions on social media or anywhere else in public affect the entire profession or certainly their organization. And we now have a Supreme Court ruling that helps clarify when your social media is actually a government action versus private. The thing is that if you're a police officer and you post something that is really offensive on social media, who are you helping? And you're entitled to think and say and do anything legal, but when you put on that badge, you are accepting a higher responsibility. You're volunteering to to adhere to a higher standard. And one example that comes up pretty often is if you have an officer whose personal vehicle has racist or other questionable bumper stickers on it. First Amendment, sure. But should that vehicle be parked in front of the police station? No. Because if somebody sees that car, sees that bumper sticker, when they're trying to come in to report a crime or to help solve something or to get help, they're not going to feel like the people inside the building are going to help them. So keep your Confederate flags at home.
There you go. And we'll leave it at that note. Doug, this was exactly what I was hoping for. This explained a lot, and I hope the audience, they had some great questions in there too. Thank you very much, Doug, for your time. I know you're a busy man. In the links in the show notes, there is a link to Doug's book, which has a discount with the using the word Sarge in it. It's a link. Just click on it, and you can order the book right then and there. So, Doug, thank you very much for coming on and joining us.
This has been my pleasure. Thank you. And I look forward to lots of good communications coming from everybody who's been watching.
Great. Thank you. Just hang on one second, Doug. We're going to end it. All right, guys. Good night.